The case began as a simple trip into the Montana wilderness. A father and his teenage son packed up a small camper, drove north, and set up in a quiet forest clearing. They were supposed to spend a weekend together, campfires, hiking trails, a short escape. They never came back. When investigators reached the clearing, they found the camper door open. Two plates of food sat cooling on the table. Boots were left neatly by the step. Jackets still hung on their hooks. A lantern burned low, as if the family would return at any moment. But they didn't. Search teams combed the woods for days. Helicopters swept the ridges. Dogs traced the edges of the clearing. Nothing explained where father and son had gone. No footprints. No struggle. Only silence. Years passed. Detectives reopened the file again and again. Rumors came and went. An accident, a crime, something stranger. But the same question remained. What really happened in that forest clearing? 3 decades later, new evidence surfaced. For the first time, investigators stepped into a hidden room buried beneath the trees. And what they found inside changed everything. Tonight, we follow the quiet facts, step by step, to the room the forest kept secret. When investigators arrived at the forest clearing, the scene looked frozen in time. A small camper stood with its door ajar, the screen shifting back and forth on a squeaky hinge. Nothing outside appeared disturbed. No forced entry. No broken windows. Just silence and the faint movement of the door. Inside, the first detail noted was a lantern still burning low on the counter. Its weak glow lit the fold-out table. On it sat 2 paper plates of chili, now cold, with crackers beside them. 2 metal cups were half full. Nothing had spilled. Nothing was broken. It looked as if a meal had been paused halfway through. Near the step were 2 pairs of boots. One large, one small. Both neatly placed, laces undone. Jackets still hung from hooks above. A wallet was visible in one pocket, untouched. On the bunk rested a cassette player. A tape had been loaded, headphones coiled neatly, but the play button had never been pressed. Most striking was a small notebook left beside the lantern. The early pages were filled with sketches of animal tracks, notes about a trail, and casual remarks about dinner. The final entry, however, stood out. The handwriting was heavier, pressed deep into the page. It read, "He says someone is out there." Outside, deputies scanned the clearing. The soil was packed with pine needles and moss, leaving no clear footprints, no drag marks, no broken branches. Nothing to suggest where the two had gone. The investigators recorded what they saw. Food untouched, belongings in place, no signs of violence. And yet, everything about the camper suggested 2 people had left suddenly and never come back. It felt like father and son had stepped out for a moment and simply dissolved into the trees. Deputies moved into the clearing with deliberate care. The first order was documentation. Photographs were taken from every angle: the open door, the lantern, the plates of food, the boots by the step. Nothing was touched until each detail was frozen on film. Inside the camper, evidence bags came out. The plates and cups were sealed, the cassette player lifted carefully with gloves, the jackets tagged. The small notebook, with its heavy final line, was placed in a separate bag. Every object was catalogued, each location noted. Outside, the deputies circled the clearing. They crouched low, studying the ground for impressions. The surface was firm, pine needles, moss, hard soil. No clear footprints, no drag marks. Nothing to suggest panic or a struggle, only a flat carpet of forest floor that gave away nothing. A wider perimeter was then established. Bright tape was strung between trees, marking off the site. Radios cracked as assignments were given. A grid search would begin, slow, methodical, every step logged. Teams were spaced in lines, moving shoulder to shoulder into the timber. Each deputy carried a flag to mark disturbances, broken branches, scraps of fabric, anything that might connect to the vanished father and son. Dogs were brought in, handlers guiding them along the clearing's edge. The animals sniffed the moss, circled, then stalled. The scent trail ended within yards of the camper. Beyond that, nothing carried forward. From the air, a helicopter traced the valleys and ridges. Its rotor wash stirred the treetops, but revealed no sign of movement below. By mid-afternoon, the grid had extended half a mile in every direction. The results were the same. No discarded gear, no footprints, no signs of departure. The forest stood untouched, as if the two had stepped out of the camper and simply dissolved. Deputies logged their notes. Food left in place, belongings intact, search negative for tracks or signs of exit. The evidence pointed to absence, sudden, unexplained, complete. The scene was secured, the clearing preserved. The next phase would move beyond the immediate site, but the first impression had already taken hold among the investigators. Father and son had not walked away in any way the forest was willing to show. By the time the sheriff arrived at the site, deputies had already taped off the clearing and logged the first round of evidence. He studied the camper for a long moment before speaking. Nothing about it looked violent, but nothing about it looked voluntary either. His first decision was scale. A single clearing was too narrow. The search had to push outward in measured circles, each wider than the last. On the hood of a truck, a map was unrolled and pinned with markers. The sheriff's pen traced rings radiating from the camper. Teams were assigned sectors, each expected to return with notes, flags, and photographs. Dogs were redeployed. Handlers led them from the doorway of the camper into the trees. The animals sniffed intently, circled once, and then faltered. The scent did not carry. Within 100 yards, the trail was gone. Handlers reported the same result again and again. It was as if the scent evaporated at the tree line. Helicopters joined overhead, their rotors thundering across the canopy. From above, the view stretched for miles, ridges, streams, and meadows, but no sign of two people moving through. No bright clothing, no campfire smoke, no figures on the trails. On the ground, deputies moved slowly through their grids. They marked branches, checked for fabric snags, studied the soil for prints. Every note came back the same, negative. No disturbance beyond what belonged to the forest itself. As reports filtered back to the command post, the sheriff wrote them into his log. Plates of food, belongings in place, no footprints, dogs without a trail, aerial sweeps clear. The facts lined up neatly, but none of them explained where father and son had gone. By evening, the clearing looked like a base camp. Radios crackled, vehicles idled, deputies checked in and out of their sectors. The system was precise, the manpower heavy, yet the woods gave nothing in return. The sheriff studied the map again as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Concentric circles filled with ink, each marked as searched. The lines were expanding, but the answers weren't. The forest kept its silence. No broken path, no trail to follow, no sign of exit. The official log recorded the conclusion for the day. Search negative for tracks, negative for struggle, negative for direction of travel. What moves through the trees without leaving a path remained the question no one could write an answer to. At headquarters, the next step was to speak with the family. Investigators arranged an interview with Lena Harlow, the boy's mother and David's former wife. She arrived carrying a recent photograph of her son, her hand shaking as she passed it across the table. The interview began with routine questions. Lena confirmed the trip had been planned for weeks. David had wanted time alone with Jake after the divorce. She described him as steady, reliable, the kind of father who would not leave without telling someone. When asked directly if she believed he could have harmed their son, she answered firmly, "No." Investigators noted her voice remained steady until the conversation shifted to sightings. Lena recalled something that stood out in the weeks before the trip. She remembered a rust-colored pickup truck parked near David's workshop more than once. At first she dismissed it, an old vehicle, unfamiliar plates, but the detail returned to her when the camper was found. She believed it was worth mentioning. The note was logged carefully. A vehicle sighting was tangible. Unlike rumors, it could be traced, compared, and entered into reports. Lena also repeated what she had told friends in the days after the disappearance. David would never abandon Jake. She emphasized his devotion, his plans for the boy's future, his steady work. He was trying to prove he could still be a good father, she said, leaning across the table. The investigators recorded her statements word for word. Her certainty, her description of the pickup, and her insistence that something external had intervened all became part of the official file. When the interview ended, Lena asked one final question. "You'll keep looking, won't you?" Her tone was less request than command. The lead investigator told her the search would continue. She nodded once, folded the photograph back into her hands, and left. The report was filed that evening. Alongside notes on the camper and the silent clearing, a new entry now stood out. Possible surveillance vehicle, rust pickup, seen near workshop. It was not proof, but it was a direction. And in a case with no footprints, no trail, and no sign of where father and son had gone, even a faint direction was something investigators could not ignore. In the days that followed, investigators logged dozens of tips. Most were discarded as quickly as they arrived. A fisherman claimed he saw two figures walking along a ridge, but his timeline placed them miles from where the camper had been parked. A hiker reported hearing shouting near a stream, but deputies found no trace in the area. Another caller insisted the family had driven out of the county entirely, but highway records showed no such movement. Each statement was written into the file, then crossed out with no corroboration. False leads piled high, noise louder than the evidence. Among the noise, one detail repeated more than once. Separate campers, days apart, described the same unsettling experience, footsteps circling their tents at night. The reports were vague. No one had seen a face. Some said it sounded like a man's stride. Others weren't sure. But all agreed the steps were measured, deliberate, moving just outside the canvas, then fading into the trees. Investigators weighed the claims carefully. Unlike the ridge sighting or the highway rumor, these accounts matched the general area of the clearing. They were consistent enough to earn a place in the official summary. Still, the detail raised more questions than it answered. Were the footsteps connected to the missing father and son? Or was it another camper, another hiker, someone passing through unseen? Detectives logged the information without speculation. The wording was precise. Multiple reports of footsteps outside tents at night, no visual confirmation. By the end of the week, the file held two things investigators considered worth carrying forward: the rust-colored pickup Lena had described, and the footstep reports near the campsite. Everything else, the sightings on ridges, the shouts by streams, the highway rumors, were labeled background noise. The clearing itself remained unchanged. Food sealed in evidence bags. The lantern, the boots, the notebook, all cataloged, all silent. And the case, even in these early days, was already starting to feel heavier than the evidence it contained. After 2 weeks of continuous effort, the sheriff's office made the decision to scale back operations. Search grids had been extended miles from the original clearing. Helicopters had flown repeated passes over valleys and ridges. Dogs had been run until their handlers reported nothing more to track. Still, no sign of father or son had been found. The official order was issued: suspend active search, preserve evidence, and transition the matter into an open investigation. Volunteers were thanked and dismissed. Deputies packed away the perimeter tape. The forest was left to its quiet again. The camper itself was hauled from the clearing on a flatbed. Once at impound, technicians went over every surface. Cabinets were opened, contents cataloged, photographs taken of each detail. The lantern, the plates, the cups, the cassette player, all were stored in sealed bags. Particular attention was given to the small notebook. Investigators photographed each page, scanned the handwriting, and noted the progression from casual sketches to the final line pressed hard into the paper. "He says someone is out there." The phrase was entered into the official log. Deputies referred to it simply as the note. In meetings, it became shorthand for the entire mystery. With the evidence secured and no new lead surfacing, the file shifted from daily updates to periodic checks. Tips were still taken, but most were quickly dismissed. Rumors spread through town, but none could be verified. The sheriff closed the initial phase of the report with a plain conclusion. Search negative for remains or signs of travel. Camper impounded. Evidence logged. Case unresolved. It was a clinical entry, but the words carried weight. A father and son had walked into the woods. The forest had returned nothing. The notebook remained the sharpest detail in a case already going cold. A single line, without context, pointing to someone or something beyond the camper's thin walls. And in the sheriff's notes, one sentence stood alone at the bottom of the page. The last line becomes the first question. Years passed before the file was pulled again. When Detective Dana Ruiz transferred into the county's small cold case unit, the disappearance was one of the first folders handed across her desk. The contents were thick: photographs of the camper, logs from the search, maps filled with rings, and page after page of tips. Ruiz began with the physical evidence. Advances in testing meant new opportunities. The notebook, the plates, the jackets, and the cassette player were all resubmitted for DNA analysis. Results came back consistent with the original findings. Only the father and the son. No third profile emerged. It confirmed the absence of strangers, but did nothing to explain the disappearance. She then studied the maps. The original sheriff had drawn concentric rings around the clearing, each representing a day of search. Ruiz added her own layers. She marked every tip, sighting, and report in a different color. Slowly, a pattern began to appear. The majority of unreliable tips scattered across the valley, but several credible ones clustered near a specific ridge line and a drainage wash to the west of the original campsite. The reports of footsteps near tents, vague as they were, pointed in the same direction. When Ruiz cross-referenced the family interview notes, the pattern tightened further. The detail Lena Harlow had given years earlier, the rust-colored pickup seen parked by David's workshop, surfaced again. Two unrelated witnesses had also described a similar vehicle near forest access roads during the week of the disappearance. It wasn't proof. No license plate, no direct identification. But in cold cases, repetition carried weight. If a rust pickup had been seen near town, and again near the ridge line, then it tied the family's private account to the public tips. Ruiz highlighted the ridge and drainage wash on her updated map. She noted the alignment. Workshop sighting, camper clearing, repeated vehicle description, clustered reports of unease in the woods. The case had no trail, but it now had a direction. The official report from her review was precise. Evidence retested, DNA consistent with father and son only. Witness accounts revisited, multiple references to rust-colored pickup, clustered in proximity to ridge west of clearing. Area identified as priority zone for renewed search. Ruiz didn't speculate beyond the facts. She didn't need to. For the first time in decades, the investigation pointed to something specific, a corridor of land that might hold what had been hidden since the summer the camper door was left open. The case was no longer dormant. It was moving again, quietly, on the strength of repetition and the faint patterns drawn between maps and memories. And in the detective's own notes, one line underscored the page. Patterns point to a route, not a campsite. The search west of the original clearing began with small details. Teams walked ridge lines, flagged disturbances, and checked dry washes. For weeks the work turned up little more than animal sign and storm-felled timber. Then, in late summer, a deputy sweeping a narrow trail noticed something unusual, a square of metal just visible beneath pine needles and soil. The find was marked, photographed, and escalated. Within hours, the FBI's evidence response team was on site. They cleared brush, cut back roots, and exposed what looked like a heavy steel hatch set flush with the ground. It was rusted at the edges but intact. No record showed a structure here. No permits. No explanations. The hatch resisted at first, but when tools forced it open, a stale draft rose from below. The smell was damp, sour, sealed too long. Lights were rigged, ropes lowered. Agents descended one by one into the dark. What they found was not natural. It was a room, roughly square, dug into earth and reinforced with poured concrete. The ceiling was low enough that taller agents stooped. Moisture streaked the walls. On one side stood metal shelving lined with objects that had rusted and decayed with time. Canned goods from brands discontinued decades earlier, lanterns long corroded, a stack of blankets stiff with mildew. At the center was a chair. Its frame was bolted into the concrete floor. Leather straps dangled from the arms, cracked but still identifiable. Agents paused there, silent, before photographing every angle. Against the far wall, their lights caught markings. At first they looked like scratches in the concrete, but closer inspection showed deliberate repetition, a name written again and again, layered over itself until the wall seemed covered. The letters spelled one word: Aaron. The scrawls varied in size, some jagged, some faint, others pressed hard into the surface. Hundreds of them, all etched by hand with whatever tool had been available. Near the chair sat a small wooden box. Inside were scattered personal items, a comb, a deck of cards, scraps of plaid fabric. Each was bagged and sealed. On the floor nearby, agents recovered a water-warped notebook. Many pages had blurred into stains, but a few words remained legible. One line stood out: "Keep quiet." "They're listening." The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but still clear. The entry was logged, photographed, and placed into evidence. The team continued to document every feature of the chamber. Anchor points set into the wall, a rusted cot in one corner, chains fixed with bolts. The air was oppressive, carrying the weight of confinement. No bodies were found. No direct trace of who had built the room, but the impression was unmistakable. This was not a survival shelter or storage space. It was a holding cell. Back above ground, the discovery was relayed to command. The sheriff and federal agents gathered at the taped perimeter. Notes were read aloud. Underground structure, approximately 12 by 12 feet, reinforced walls, interior artifacts cataloged, multiple repetitions of name Aaron on wall. The site was sealed. Floodlights were set up for overnight processing. Each item, each surface, was dusted, swabbed, and bagged. Soil samples were taken. Concrete was chipped for dating. Forensic notes emphasized what was absent: no usable fingerprints beyond degradation, no third-party DNA, no clear evidence of who had constructed the room. The space was old, carefully hidden, and meant to be forgotten. In the official FBI summary, one line captured the discovery: beneath ridge west of clearing, subterranean structure located, evidence consistent with long-term confinement. Among investigators, the detail repeated most often was not the chair, not the shelves, not the cot. It was the wall. A boy's name written hundreds of times in concrete, the only voice left in a room designed to erase sound. The case had gone from silence to something far darker. What began with two plates cooling on a table now led to a hidden place no one had been meant to find. The forest had yielded part of its secret, and investigators knew the next question would be harder than any before. Who had built the room, and who had been kept there? Once the underground room was sealed and cleared, evidence moved to federal labs for analysis. Each item, the cans, the chair, the notebook, the scraps of fabric, was logged under chain of custody. Technicians worked methodically, knowing the case had waited decades already. The first results came from the concrete itself. Samples chipped from the wall and floor were examined with chemical dating methods. The mix contained aggregates and additives common to small-scale pours in the early 1990s. Nothing modern, nothing advanced. The estimate placed construction within a few years of the Harlow disappearance. Attention then shifted to the canned goods. Most labels were water-damaged, but several remained intact enough to identify. The brands had discontinued certain packaging lines in the mid-90s. Their expiration dates, cross-checked against old company records, confirmed the same window. Whoever stocked the shelves had done so around the time David and Jake vanished. The shelves and chair were swabbed repeatedly. DNA testing returned only degraded traces, no full third-party profiles, no clear match. Investigators noted the absence as strongly as they did the presence. Whoever used the room had cleaned carefully or had left nothing of themselves behind. Then came a break. One can, collapsed inward from rust, still carried a fragment of label strong enough to peel. Under the adhesive, latent fingerprint residue was found. It was partial, blurred by time, but rich detail remained. Forensic examiners enhanced the print digitally. The result was run through national databases. The match was tentative but significant. A drifter named Charles Danner, arrested briefly in a neighboring state in the late 1980s for trespassing and petty theft. His record was thin, his last known address untraceable. No further entries appeared after the mid-90s. The lab report highlighted the caution. Partial print, probabilistic match. Not definitive. Investigative lead only. But even as a lead, it gave the case something it hadn't had in 3 decades, a possible human connection beyond the Harlow family. Other details rounded out the report. Soil samples from the floor matched local geology, confirming the chamber was dug in place rather than prefabricated. The warped notebook's ink composition matched consumer pencils of the early 1990s, aligning with the construction window. The scratched wall, tested for tool residue, showed repeated use of a metal object, likely a nail or screw. Still, the evidence did not name who poured the concrete, who strapped the chair, or who carved the name Aaron again and again. It only narrowed the time frame, confirmed the room's age, and suggested one individual who might have touched the cans inside. The summary conclusion read, structure dated early 1990s. Stocked within disappearance window. No foreign DNA recovered. Partial latent fingerprint linked probabilistically to subject Charles Danner. Subject whereabouts unknown since mid-1990s. For investigators, it was not closure. But it was the first thread in decades that could be pulled. A hidden room, a name on a wall, and now a fingerprint pointing to a man who had once drifted through the same forests. The forest had kept its silence. The lab, at least, had given it a voice. Weeks after the bunker discovery, search teams refocused on the ridge and drainage wash marked in Detective Ruiz's maps. The terrain was steep, scattered with rock outcrops and patches of fallen timber. Progress was slow. Crews walked in staggered lines, probing soil with poles, checking hollows where water had once pooled. It was in a shallow depression, shaded by leaning pines, that a deputy spotted what looked like fabric tangled in roots. The area was flagged, photographed, and secured before anyone touched the site. Forensic specialists moved in. Brushes cleared away soil inch by inch. What emerged was the outline of human remains. The frame was incomplete, but enough structure remained to identify a grown man. The bones were discolored by time, brittle, but still intact in sections. The clothing fragments told more. A shirt, faded and torn, yielded fibers that were carefully lifted and bagged. The pattern was checked against family photographs supplied years earlier. The shirt matched what David Harlow had been known to wear on the day he left for the trip. Examination of the skeletal remains revealed older healed injuries, fractures in the ribs and wrist, consistent with accidents or physical labor. But the fatal trauma was clear. The skull showed evidence of blunt force impact. The fracture pattern indicated a heavy blow delivered to the side of the head. It was not accidental. It was homicide. Nearby soil samples were collected, and the surrounding ground was sifted. Buttons, fragments of leather, and rusted snaps were logged. Everything was tagged and transported under chain of custody. When lab comparisons came back, the shirt fibers matched a scrap recovered from the underground room. The link was direct. The man buried on the ridge had been inside the hidden structure at some point before his death. The official report named him David Harlow, father of the missing boy. Detective Ruiz read the findings into the file with deliberate precision. The language was clinical, but the implications heavy. Remains identified as adult male. Positive match to Harlow. Evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with homicide. Clothing fibers consistent with bunker artifact. The discovery solved one question while opening others. David had not walked away voluntarily. He had not disappeared into the wilderness by choice. He had been struck down and buried. The tie to the bunker suggested captivity or at minimum forced presence. But the question of who held control, who poured the concrete, who stocked the shelves, who wrote the name Aaron, remained unanswered. The ridge site was sealed and processed again before crews left. Every inch was photographed, every bone fragment logged. Even as the evidence was collected, the weight of the case deepened. For more than 30 years, the file had held only absence, an empty camper, cooling plates, a final notebook line. Now it held remains, trauma, and proof of violence. Detective Ruiz closed the day's entry with one line that echoed through the unit. Victim confirmed. Cause of death established. Perpetrator unknown. The forest had returned part of its secret. But only part. News of the discovery spread quickly. The county organized a memorial service on the courthouse lawn. Photographs of David and Jake were displayed beside candles and flowers. Reporters stood at the edge of the crowd, recording every word. Lena Harlow spoke briefly. She thanked the searchers who had never stopped believing the truth would surface. Her voice was steady as she told the community what she had told investigators years earlier, that David was a devoted father who would never have abandoned his son. He was trying to protect Jake, she said, her hands gripping the podium. Whatever happened out there, he didn't choose to leave him. The crowd nodded, and her certainty carried weight. To many, David became less a suspect of rumor and more a victim confirmed. In the investigation room, the tone was quieter. Detectives filed the lab reports, taped new maps to the wall, and reviewed what the evidence actually showed. The shirt fibers linked David to the underground room. The trauma on his skull pointed to homicide, but the details stopped there. No record placed Jake in the bunker. No witness placed anyone else with them. The rust pickup remained a loose thread, noted but unconfirmed. The partial fingerprint match to Charles Danner was still listed as probabilistic, not absolute. And the scratched wall, covered with the name Aaron, added confusion more than clarity. Detective Ruiz wrote her notes in plain language. Community believes father as protector. Evidence confirms victim status, but not circumstances. Unknown if father confined son or if both confined by third party. Case remains open. Behind closed doors, the unit discussed scenarios. Could David have been forced into the room? Could Jake have been held separately? If Danner was involved, was he working alone? Each question opened into more speculation, none supported by enough proof to move forward. The public needed closure. The detectives needed caution. Between those two needs stretched the uncomfortable gap the case had lived in for decades. The memorial ended with silence, a bell rung once for each of the missing. In the file, the day closed with a single sentence. Public narrative established, father as victim, mother as advocate. Investigative stance remains unresolved. The voices outside spoke with certainty. Inside the case file, certainty was still absent. The case file closed not with resolution, but with fragments. A camper door left open, plates of food cooling on a table. A final notebook line pressed hard into the page. Years later, an underground room hidden beneath the ridge. A wall filled with a boy's name. A warped notebook warning someone to keep quiet. The remains of a father, skull fractured, shirt fibers linking him to that chamber. Detectives noted what was certain. David Harlow was a victim of homicide. His son, Jake, was never found. The fingerprint tied to Charles Danner remained only a partial lead. The rust-colored pickup was still an unconfirmed sighting, and the scratched concrete carried a name no one could place. In the official summary, the language was cautious. Case unresolved. Evidence supports foul play. Further investigation required. In the private notes, the tone was sharper. The forest gave back fragments, never the whole. For the community, the story ended with a memorial. For investigators, it remained open. And for the families who lived with the silence, it was neither. What began as a weekend camping trip had become a mystery that stretched across decades. The woods had kept their secrets, offering only glimpses when forced. The detective who wrote the last entry put it plainly. Some cases don't close. They wait. And so this one waits still, between evidence and absence, between rumor and fact. If you've followed this far, you know why these stories matter. They remind us how fragile the line is between ordinary life and disappearance, between certainty and doubt. Subscribe for more careful, fact-first accounts, and share what you think happened, respectfully, in the comments below. Because in cases like this, the truth is not a headline. It's a slow echo, a whisper the woods still haven't given back.